Hey guys, tonight we're slipping between the sheets of time to explore what medieval lovers actually did in bed. And it's not all silk and sonnets. Imagine the scent of unwashed linen smoke curling from a single candle, and the suspiciously squishy mattress beneath you, made from straw moss, or if you're lucky, feathers stolen from the monastery geese. You think you've had awkward sleepovers, try bedding down next to 6 other people, a howling pig underfoot, and the lord of the manor snoring across the room like a dying dragon. Welcome to romance 14th century style. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this if you're still clinging to modern ideas of privacy, hygiene, or dental care. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying on your back, but not in your own bed. No springs, no memory foam, just a wide wooden frame covered with a sackcloth stuffed with hay, if you're a peasant, or feathers if you're noble and greedy. The mattress is oddly warm not because of a heated blanket, but because 2 other people, your cousins, your neighbor, a traveler, are pressed up against you. Your body is a tangle of limbs and sweat, and you can't tell if the warmth is comforting or just suspicious. This is normal. Medieval beds weren't places for solitude or intimacy. They were communal, chaotic, and absolutely public. The concept of a private bedroom hadn't yet trickled down to the average European villager. Walls were expensive. Curtains even more so. You were lucky to have one wooden partition between your bed and the family pig. And you didn't just sleep with your lover. You slept with your siblings, grandparents, and occasionally your livestock. The medieval belief was that body heat was life-saving, and the bed was as much about survival as it was about sleep. You might be surprised how many love stories began with, "Well, we were crammed into the same mattress during the frost." But romance, of course, found its way in, even if your mother-in-law was breathing heavily 2 feet away. Now imagine being in love or lust and trying to sneak in a few touches under the blanket while a snoring uncle drooled nearby. You couldn't just lock the door and light a scented candle. There was no privacy, no door, often not even a separate room. But you made do. Medieval couples perfected the art of subtle fumbling. A graze of the hand under the tunic, a shared glance across the fire, a slow shift closer under the covers. Love had to be clever, and sometimes dangerous. Unmarried couples caught sneaking under the covers could face steep fines, public shame, or a forced wedding. Sex wasn't just a private affair, it was a social contract. If you were seen crawling out of someone's bed at dawn, even with all your clothes on, people talked. And if they talked loud enough, the church got involved. Still, people found ways. They used code. A single red ribbon in the hair. A love token dropped accidentally into a cup. A nocturnal visit justified by nightmares or cold feet. Passion in the medieval sense wasn't just about desire, it was about risk. Every whispered word could become a marriage vow, and every touch might turn into 10 years of raising goats together. Let's talk bedding. It's not soft, not breathable, certainly not hypoallergenic. Most beds were sacks of hay or straw laid over wooden planks. Sheets were a luxury. If you had them, they were coarse and scratchy, washed maybe once every few months, in lye soap that smelled more like old onions than lavender. But beds even then were emotional spaces, where children were born, where illnesses were nursed, where love, clumsy, itchy, beautiful love was made. Nobles, of course, had better options. Huge high canopy beds with embroidered curtains that could be pulled shut mostly to keep out the draft, but also useful for other things. These beds were so tall, you needed a stool to climb into them. Sometimes servants warmed the sheets with hot stones or irons. But privacy still rare. A lady's maid might sleep at the foot of the bed, a favorite hound beside her. Even kings were rarely alone at night. And cleanliness, well, you didn't change your undergarments daily, or even weekly. People believed bathing too often weakened the body's defenses. So you learned to fall in love through layers of wool with the scent of the stable wafting through the window. Kisses tasted like salted meat and mead, and passion bloomed in spite of it all. Sometimes lovers met in secret. There were hidden staircases in castles' passageways, used not just by servants, but by bold lovers, defying parents and popes alike. There were coded messages hidden in embroidery poems tucked into Bibles, and in some cases nights of stolen bliss in barns, haylofts, or even graveyards. Yes, you heard that right. Graveyards offered privacy. No one wandered there after dark. And yet even amidst fleas, freezing temperatures, and family members curled at your feet, there was tenderness. Fingers tracing a lover's brow. Whispered jokes in the dark. The hush of shared breath in the early hours when the fire had gone out and the village was silent. In these moments, love was raw and real, stripped of all pretense. You weren't making love in a sterilized, climate-controlled room. You were making it in the real world, amidst snoring swine and sacred vows. And somehow, that made it more powerful. You wake up before the sun, not because you're rested, but because someone's elbow is in your eye and the fire's gone out. The room is dark but not silent. There's the low wheeze of your father's breath, the wet snort of the family pig rooting near the hearth, and the unmistakable sound of someone relieving themselves just outside the door. Welcome to another day in medieval love. You shift carefully, trying not to wake the others. Your lover, if they're there at all, is probably pretending to sleep. Even the act of waking together is charged dangerous. If you're not married, routine if you are. And if you're married, well, the romance may have ended with the dowry. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't about love. It was about land, livestock, strategic alliances. You didn't pick your partner with butterflies in your stomach. You picked them, or more often your parents picked them based on what they could offer. And that meant your lover might be a stranger, a cousin, or someone twice your age with a wheezy laugh and more hair in their ears than on their head. But even in arranged marriages, there were expectations for what went on in bed. The church had very clear opinions. Sex was for procreation. It was supposed to happen regularly and in a certain way. Anything else, anything playful, inventive, or joyful was suspect. Forbidden, even. You were supposed to lie still, eyes closed. No noise, no pleasure. Just a quiet, dutiful act done beneath a crucifix and hopefully resulting in a baby. That was the ideal. But you weren't ideal. Not really. You were curious, restless, and so were many others. Despite the church's teachings, people found ways to express passion. Secret manuals circulated. Whispered advice passed between maids. There were midwives who knew a thing or two, and older women who spoke plainly over spinning wheels. And there were troubadours singing songs not just of chivalry and dragons, but of kisses stolen in gardens and lovers who undressed each other in moonlight. There were even love potions, infusions made from wild herbs, crushed petals, wine, and just a touch of desperation. Women brewed them to capture affection, Men drank them to inflame desire. They probably didn't work. But in a world where your future was dictated by your father's livestock count, even a glimmer of romance was worth swallowing something strange. If you were lucky, you loved someone who loved you back. And if you were very lucky, you loved someone whose body you could actually touch. But touching wasn't straightforward. There were rules. You couldn't just reach out and graze a hand in public. Even holding hands could be scandalous, especially if someone saw. That's why the bed, despite its communal chaos, was so essential. At night, hidden beneath rough wool blankets, bodies could speak the truths that mouths dared not. Some lovers invented codes, secret taps of the fingers, shifts in breath, shared movements beneath the covers. One nudge meant wait. 2 nudges meant now. And if a third nudge followed well, that meant the uncle had rolled over and they had to stop immediately. The choreography of medieval love was absurd and tender. It required timing, patience, and an astonishing tolerance for smells. And then there were the bundling boards. In some regions, especially in colder rural areas, courting couples were actually allowed to share a bed, as long as there was a thick wooden board placed between them. A physical barrier meant to preserve chastity while still allowing emotional closeness. In some cases, girls were sewn into sack-like bundling bags to prevent any funny business. Of course, people are inventive, and those boards were climbed, rolled under, or outright removed more than anyone admitted. But even those innocent nights carried weight. If someone heard laughter or movement, rumors started. And if rumors started, reputations fell. A single night could lead to a lifetime, or ruin. It didn't help that pregnancy was often visible before love was. There were no pregnancy tests, no plan B, no discretion. And when bellies swelled, families had to act fast. Sometimes that meant a quick wedding, sometimes a quiet visit to a nunnery, and sometimes it meant exile, especially for the girl. The boy might get a talking to. The girl could lose everything. So lovers had to be careful, and fast, and silent. You learned to listen for footsteps, to hold your breath when a floorboard creaked, to feign sleep so convincingly you fooled even yourself. Making love in the Middle Ages wasn't just physical, it was a test of stealth. And yet there was beauty in that. Because when everything is forbidden, even a whisper becomes electric. A shared glance across a fire-lit room. A fingertip tracing the edge of a linen sleeve. The press of knees beneath the table. These things became sacred. More thrilling than any modern date, any swipe-right hookup, any scripted fantasy. You didn't have Netflix or scented candles or even a lock on the door, but you had firelight and frost on the windows and a heart that beat faster at the thought of a single secret kiss. Lovers whispered in Latin and French and Old English. They made up words, stole lines from songs, invented names for parts of the body they weren't supposed to touch. They were poets, even when they didn't know how to write. And the bed, scratchy, crowded, and loud, was the place where that poetry was whispered half in fear, half in joy. You shift again under the blanket, your limbs stiff from the chill. The body beside you stirs barely. Maybe they're awake too. Maybe they're thinking the same thing. One nudge. Pause. 2 nudges. And the quiet rhythm of medieval love begins again. You lie there, eyes open now, tracing the shadows cast on the ceiling by the faint flicker of firelight. Everything smells faintly of wool smoke and someone's feet. It's not exactly erotic, and yet somehow it is. Maybe because you know that what you're doing, lying beside someone you long for in silence and stolen breath, is as close to intimacy as this world allows. And tonight, you're thinking about what's forbidden. Not just who, but how. Because what medieval lovers did in bed wasn't just shaped by who they shared it with, but by what the church told them was acceptable. And that list was shorter than you'd think. Missionary. Lights out. No sounds. No pleasure. No fun. That was the expectation. Anything else touching too much, looking too long, even laughing could be called a sin. Even married couples were reminded not to enjoy themselves too obviously. Passion was risky. It was something whispered about, warned against, confessed over. And yet, it happened anyway. People experimented. They broke rules. They discovered that the human body didn't care much for doctrine. It just craved warmth, connection, and release. There were priests who whispered warnings from the pulpit and then visited lovers in secret by moonlight. There were married couples who followed the rules in public, but behind closed curtains explored each other with wonder. There were men and women who by candlelight learned each other's bodies with reverence that no sermon could shame. Of course, not all of it was gentle. Consent, as you know, it didn't exist. Marital rape wasn't a crime. A woman's body was seen as a vessel for lineage, not a temple for joy. And yet, within the narrow margins, allowed some couples found mutual tenderness. They carved out spaces for affection within the heavy architecture of duty. You run your hand slowly along the blanket fingertips, brushing the coarse weave. Imagine tracing that same line on someone's skin. In the quiet, palm of a cold night touch becomes language, especially when words are dangerous. Medieval lovers weren't just forbidden from doing things, they were forbidden from naming them. There was no easy word for foreplay, no polite way to say desire. Euphemisms flourished. Lovers invented code. Women said their humors were stirred. Men claimed to have nightly urgency. A shared glance could speak louder than any poem. And sometimes there were poems. Lyrical, wild, aching verses scribbled in the margins of prayer books or etched into barn doors. There were bawdy songs passed around at taverns filled with puns about butter churns and plows, and love letters hidden in baskets of bread. Romance was smuggled into daily life disguised as chores and prayers, and some dared to dream of more. In certain corners of Europe, especially in the courts of southern France and northern Italy, a strange and beautiful idea emerged: courtly love. It wasn't practical. It wasn't even sexual, really. It was about longing, idealized affection. The knight worshiping the lady pretending not to notice. It was a love so restrained it almost hurt. A love made sacred by distance and impossibility. And it filtered into the bedroom not just through stories and songs, but through expectations. A knight might sleep with a token from his lady, a ribbon, a glove tied around his arm. A lady might gaze out her window waiting for a glimpse of her lover returning from the hunt. They might not touch for years, but the thought of each other colored every night beneath the blanket. Still, not everyone was noble. Not everyone could afford to fall in love from afar. Most people were earthy, direct, and occasionally absurd. You hear a story once from a village outside Prague. A young couple who were caught kissing behind a church. As punishment, the priest married them on the spot. No witnesses, no feast, just a blessing, a handshake, and a firm warning not to do it again in public. That night they returned to their shared bed, already crowded with cousins, and whispered to each other, "Well, I guess this is it." Their wedding night took place in total silence under one moth-eaten blanket, with someone's foot in the small of the bride's back. And somehow, it was still sweet. You think about all the ways people touched, even when they weren't supposed to. A brush of knees during supper, a hand laid on another's spine while climbing a ladder, a shared drink from the same cup. These small things were as charged as kisses, maybe more. And then there was sleep. Modern love often ends the night with sleep as a quiet afterthought. But in the Middle Ages, sleep was part of the rhythm of passion. You didn't fall into a blissful 8 hours. No. You drifted in and out often in 2 distinct phases. First sleep, then wakefulness, then second sleep. And during that midnight gap called the watch lovers often stirred. The fire was low, the village silent. Dreams still clung to your skin. This was when you turned to each other not just for heat, but for tenderness. Words spoken in that drowsy hour felt truer somehow. Sleep softened everything, judgment, shame, fear. And what happened in the shadows, between sleeps, that was yours alone. Even in a world of rules and restrictions, people found cracks to slip through. They created a new kind of intimacy, one forged in silence, shaped by shadows, made stronger by the very things meant to prevent it. You shift again, and the blanket rises and falls with your breath. The body beside you sighs in sleep, and for a moment, in this straw-filled bed, with its scratchy sheets and the draft whistling through the shutters, you feel something like peace. Something like love, something that even time can't take away. The fire has burned down to embers now glowing faintly, like the soft coals of memory. You turn your face into the pillow, or what passes for one a stuffed linen sack lumpy and damp on one corner, and you breathe in the faint scent of time. Someone must have placed herbs under the bed to ward off fleas. You're grateful for it, because tonight you're not alone. But you are itchy. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't just tangled in duty rules and stolen glances. It was tangled in infestations. Real ones. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, worms. Lovers in medieval Europe shared not just passion, but parasites. It didn't matter if you were a lord or a farmhand. Your bed was likely crawling with more than just feelings. You feel something scuttle. You scratch your ankle. Your lover turns over and mutters in their sleep. The sound of rats in the rafters keeps you grounded in the reality of medieval romance. It was deeply physical, often uncomfortable, and almost never clean. Bathing was rare. Not because people liked being dirty, but because water was a danger. You didn't want to open your pores. People believed warm water made the body vulnerable to disease. Plus, heating a full tub took hours, and soap made from animal fat and ash was rough enough to remove more than dirt. It scraped the skin raw. So lovers didn't bathe for each other. They adapted to each other. The scent of sweat, of unwashed linen, of smoke and dried herbs, this was the perfume of affection. You learned to trace your lover not by sight or sound, but by smell. There's something deeply intimate about that. You didn't love someone for how smooth their skin was. You loved them for the shape of their breath, the scratch of their beard, the way they laughed through their nose. You knew someone was yours when their touch felt familiar, even if their hands were rough with work and their nails were rimmed in soil. Medieval hands told stories, not soft stories, real ones, calloused from scythe and spindle, burned from tending fires, torn from berry-picking sheep, shearing sword handling. There was no manicure culture, no moisturizers. Hands were tools. And when those hands touched you, they carried the weight of a life lived, whether it was the trembling hand of a newlywed or the steady grip of a midwife guiding you through your first birth. And speaking of birth, you hear her stir beside you, your wife, or your lover, or your companion for this season of frost and shared firewood. Maybe she's pregnant. You wouldn't know for weeks, maybe months. There's no test, no clinic, just the knowledge passed down from older women. She sleeps longer, eats less, feels nauseous in the morning. Maybe her hands are warmer than usual. Pregnancy changed everything in bed. Not because it interrupted passion, though it often did, but because it turned the bedroom into something holy and terrifying. There was joy in it, yes, but also risk. Birth wasn't safe. Women died in childbirth regularly, and those who lived often bore scars that never healed. Stretch marks were called the tiger stripes of Eve. Pelvic pain never went away. Teeth were lost. Bloodletting and prayers did what they could. But childbirth was a dangerous mystery cloaked in whispered rituals and herbal teas. And yet people still made love. Often. They did it knowing what might come. They did it when they weren't supposed to, during Lent, during Advent, on feast days, on fast days, in times of mourning. The calendar was a minefield of forbidden nights. But passion didn't care. When the fire burned low and the body ached for closeness, people reached for each other anyway. And sometimes that closeness was fleeting. Not all love lasted. In fact, many medieval lovers went to bed not knowing if they'd see their partner again. War took them. Sickness took them. The road took them. Lovers left in the night chasing pilgrimages, plagues, or promises of coin. Some never came back. You think of all the women who laid in bed long after the candles had burned out, waiting for footsteps that never came. And all the men who rode through forests with a dried flower tucked inside their jerkin, remembering the curve of someone's smile in the firelight. Distance was a part of love then. But so was reunion. Lovers reunited with such ferocity that sometimes the first thing they did wasn't speak, but fall into each other's arms, even if years had passed, even if children had grown or faces had aged. Memory held the shape of a person long after they had gone. And when they returned, that first night back in the shared bed was clumsy, beautiful, painful. Laughter mixed with tears. It wasn't romantic the way stories say, it was raw. As though time had carved them open, and only now were they being stitched back together. You roll onto your back again, staring up through the thatch ceiling. The stars are invisible behind smoke and winter fog, but you imagine them. You imagine being a shepherd sleeping out in the hills with your beloved, your bed, the earth itself, your blanket, the shared woolen cloak. Or maybe you're both nobility sneaking away from the banquet and ducking into the buttery to press your lips together before someone finds you. Or maybe you're just two ordinary people, wrapped in scratchy sheets, trying to stay warm, trying to be kind, trying to be close in a world that often didn't allow it. That was medieval love. Not a grand passion written in ink and legend, but a quiet series of decisions made each night to reach for someone else, to stay, to listen to their breath, to let your knees knock together in the dark and not pull away. And as your eyes drift closed, you think of all the people who did the same. Not in castles, not in ballads, but in small homes on sagging beds with hearts full of hope and hay in their hair. Your eyes flutter open again, not because of a sound, but because of a change in the air. The kind that happens when someone else is awake, too. You don't move. You just listen to the creak of weight shifting beside you, the small sigh of someone thinking in the dark. It's not always passion that stirs people at this hour. Sometimes it's memory. The medieval bed was a place of dreams, yes, but also of stories. Told not with books or lanterns, but with voices in the pitch black, when the only thing left to do was whisper. You roll onto your side and imagine it your lover recounting the tale of how they once escaped a wolf in the woods, or how their mother told them never to sleep with one foot uncovered, or the demons would drag them by it. You laugh barely, and they shush you gently, because laughter wasn't forbidden in bed, but it was rare. Everything carried weight, even stories. And yet lovers still told them, sometimes about childhood, sometimes about saints, sometimes about dreams. The act of talking while lying close, eyes closed, limbs intertwined became its own kind of foreplay. Words replaced caresses. Breath became confession. Some spoke of old romances, lost ones, a dead husband, a first love who drowned, or the girl from 2 summers ago who braided ribbons into her hair and disappeared with a traveling juggler. You didn't get over people quickly in the Middle Ages, not when every connection had weight, not when love was carved out of hardship. And your current lover, they listened, because they too had their ghosts. Lying in bed like this, wrapped in breath and stories, was often the closest people came to therapy. There was no counselor, no journal, only each other. So you whispered things in the night that you'd never say by daylight. And those secrets, folded into the bed linen, like a pressed flower, made the space sacred. You shift slightly, and your hand brushes theirs. The smallest thing. But it feels monumental. Because back then, affection wasn't casual. Even for couples who'd been married for years. People didn't walk around kissing each other goodbye or saying I love you 3 times a day. Words were expensive. Gestures were rare. But when they happened, when he gently tucked her hair behind her ear, or when she pressed a hand to his chest before turning over to sleep, they carried the weight of 10 modern love poems. It was love made visible through repetition, through care, through duty, and yes, sometimes through sex. But sex wasn't always love, and love wasn't always sex. Often the two passed each other in the dark, nodding politely, but never truly meeting. Some couples made love only a handful of times a year, on the assumption that fewer attempts meant fewer mouths to feed. But other couples, those rare ones who actually liked each other, found joy in the closeness. They had no guidebooks, no diagrams, no scented oils, just instinct and curiosity. They learned what worked, what didn't, and they passed on their knowledge quietly between sisters, between friends, between lovers. A woman might learn that putting a sprig of mint between her thighs made her feel fresher. A man might be told that cold feet were a mood killer. An old grandmother might swear by feeding her husband garlic before bed, either to invigorate him or to keep him on his own side of the mattress. Superstition and sexuality were tangled together. There were things you must do. Sleep with your head to the west. Make love only when the moon was waning. Never touch each other after eating leeks. Never lie together on a Sunday. And then there were things you must not do, because the devil was always watching. According to some medieval texts, demons lingered around beds hoping to catch lovers in moments of weakness. Particularly lustful couples were warned that succubi and incubi might slip between them. If you woke with scratches or felt drained, it wasn't from too much enthusiasm, it was from a visitor from hell. And yet people still risked it. Because desire is stronger than fear. Even in a world where sin was counted and dreams were judged, people still reached for each other in the dark. They still believed that love, real love, could be protection in itself. The bed then became a battleground, between shame and longing, between duty and delight, between the devil and the divine. Some hung rosaries over the bedposts. Others scratched charms into the bed frame, a circle of salt around the mattress, a prayer whispered before undressing. You did what you could to be safe, and then you let go. Because even then, lovers knew that vulnerability was the price of closeness. You close your eyes and let yourself feel the shape of the bed again. The pressure of the frame against your spine. The quiet rhythm of breathing. The faint sound of an owl outside asking nothing, just reminding you that the world goes on. And somewhere in the village, another couple is stirring too. Maybe in love. Maybe just lonely. Maybe trying to conceive. Maybe trying not to. Beds weren't just places of romance. They were sites of power, especially for women. Because in a world where a woman had few rights, the bedroom was sometimes the only place she held control. If not legally, then emotionally. She could withhold affection. She could guide a lover's hands. She could say no in whatever language she could muster. And sometimes she could use the rhythms of her body, when to bleed, when to lie still, to reclaim space in a life too often dictated by others. The bed became her strategy, a negotiation table, a place to dream of something more, and maybe, just maybe, a place to feel truly seen. So you reach for her hand again, this time deliberately, and she squeezes once in response. That simple act in this dark and flickering world means everything. It means yes. It means I'm here. It means tomorrow is uncertain, but tonight I'm with you. You don't speak, you just listen to the breathing beside you, soft and uneven. The kind of breath that only comes when someone's half asleep, but holding on to the thread of your presence. The night has settled into that suspended silence now, the part where time feels slower, softer, almost sacred. You shift your leg, and it brushes hers, and for a moment, everything feels older than language. This bed you lie in this moment could be happening 100 years ago, 1,000. Because what lovers did in the Middle Ages, what they did quietly, tentatively, desperately, wasn't always strange. Sometimes it was deeply familiar, and sometimes it was not. Because while modern lovers are armed with knowledge books, videos, conversations, vocabulary, your medieval counterparts were often fumbling in the dark, literally and figuratively. They didn't have diagrams. They had folklore, myths, gossip, the loudest, least accurate voice in the tavern, and maybe a nun-turned-midwife who whispered some advice over a pot of wormwood tea. You didn't know what parts went where exactly. You figured it out. And that made first times awkward, even in marriage, especially in marriage. Your wedding night wasn't just a private ritual, it was sometimes unbelievably witnessed. In certain regions, especially among the nobility, the consummation of a marriage had to be verified. Not by watching everything, but by leading the couple to the bed, handing them a drink, blessing the mattress, and then waiting outside the door. or sometimes just outside the curtain. Because a marriage wasn't complete until it had been physically sealed, the couple had to perform. And sometimes they had to show proof bedsheets stained with blood held up to a crowd as evidence of virginity. A deeply invasive, humiliating tradition built on myth and misunderstanding. And if there was no blood, there were consequences. Whispers, accusations, in some cases, annulments. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders, suddenly cold at the thought. But not every couple faced that pressure. Among the peasantry, things were often more relaxed and more practical. Love might bloom in the barn, in the field, in the back of a cart, rattling down a muddy road. And when it did, it didn't always follow rules. There were plenty of unofficial unions, hand fastings, friar marriages, agreements made without priests, made by clasping hands over a fire, and promising to live as man and wife. And when those promises were made, beds became sacred, not legal, but personal. Your first night together wasn't public. It was yours, and it was full of surprises. Because again, nobody really told you what to expect. You went by instinct, feel, and whatever hints you'd picked up while overhearing the baker's daughters talking to her friend behind the well. Some things, of course, were obvious, but other things not so much. Many medieval people believed some deeply strange things about bodies. That women had hot wombs that pulled seed into them. That a man's desire alone could cause pregnancy. That love could be seen in the eye, literally, that it left a mark in the iris. And yet amidst all the confusion, people found their way to one another. Fumbling, laughing, sometimes crying, and often whispering apologies. Because the bed was also a place of awkwardness, of mistakes. Maybe it was over too quickly. Maybe it didn't go well at all. Maybe it was uncomfortable or painful or just confusing. And the next night, maybe it got a little better. Maybe it didn't. But in the quiet hours when no one was looking, two people learned each other. Slowly, clumsily, with patience, and sometimes with joy. You roll onto your back and think about how many people, how many generations learned love in the dark. Not with music or candles or perfect timing, but in silence under itchy blankets while the wind howled through cracks in the wall. Sometimes with dogs barking in the yard. Sometimes with someone coughing in the next room. Sometimes while counting coins in your head because you weren't sure if there'd be enough flour for tomorrow's bread. Medieval love wasn't romantic. It was real. And in being real, it became something more than just the sum of its awkward parts. Because even when the first time didn't go well, even when bodies didn't fit together the way you'd imagined, even when everything was scratchy, smelly, and slightly ridiculous, you still reached for each other. You still whispered, "Are you cold? And did I hurt you? And are you okay?" And those words mattered. Those words were love. You sit up slightly, resting on your elbow. The shape beside you stirs, and you gently push hair away from their face. No combs, no shampoos. Just natural oil soot from the hearth, and maybe a ribbon if it's a feast day. You press your lips to their temple. Soft, thoughtful, ancient. Because kissing wasn't always part of lovemaking. In fact, it was sometimes avoided altogether. Too intimate, too exposing. But when it happened, when you let yourself kiss someone, really kiss someone, it meant something. In medieval love, the body mattered, but the heart mattered more. So you lie back down slowly, pulling the blanket to your chin. You feel the warmth returning now, not from the fire, but from the closeness, from the breath against your neck, from the weight of another body, not heavy, just real, and outside the world continues. Snow falls, owls blink. Somewhere a church bell rings once, just once, to remind you that time is passing. But in this bed with this person, time slows again. And in the hush between night and morning, you think maybe love, real love, has always been a little awkward, a little itchy, a little weird, but also a little wonderful. There's something about sleeping beside another person in the medieval world that changes the way you think about time. It stops being divided by clocks or calendar squares. It starts being measured in breaths, in the shift of someone's weight, in the sound of rain on the thatched roof. You blink slowly in the dark and realize this bed, this moment, might be the only soft thing in your entire day. Out there, the world is sharp, cold, brutal sometimes. You carry water in frozen buckets. You pull weeds until your spine aches. You pay taxes in chickens. You watch your neighbor die from a bad turn of weather or a blister that went wrong. But here under the covers, even if they smell like sheep, there's warmth. There's someone who touches your foot with theirs just to let you know they're still there. That is its own kind of miracle. And even miracles in this world are expected to serve a purpose. Because in the Middle Ages, your body didn't just belong to you. It belonged to your family, your church, your village. Your body was a contract. A woman's body especially was never truly her own. Before marriage, it was a symbol of her family's honor. After marriage, it was a tool for bearing heirs. Everything she did with it, when she bathed, when she bled, when she opened her legs, was scrutinized, judged, measured against invisible rules. But in the dark, when the shutters were closed and the bed curtains drawn, she could claim her body back, if only for a few moments. You imagine her now, your partner tracing her own collarbone as if remembering where she begins and ends. Maybe she whispers prayers to Saint Margaret, protector of childbirth, or Saint Agnes, protector of young girls. Maybe she prays just to herself. Because sometimes medieval women found strength in small acts. The way they braided their hair, the way they arranged herbs under the bed, the way they touched themselves when no one else could. Yes, they did that. Despite the shame, the warnings, the fear. Despite the church's fire and brimstone threats about lust and damnation. Human curiosity was stronger than dogma. Pleasure, even in secret, even in guilt, still flickered like candlelight. But it wasn't easy. Women were taught that desire lived in the devil's house, that to feel hunger in the body was to invite ruin. And yet, they felt it anyway. They learned to seek moments of softness, the stroke of a comb, the brush of fabric against thigh, the memory of a lover's breath. Some women explored their own bodies late at night, in the space between dreams and sleep, not always knowing what they were seeking, only that it felt like truth. And men, too, had their private hungers. But for men, desire was expected, even celebrated, at least when it led to heirs. A husband could demand his marital rights, and a wife could not legally refuse. The church made that clear. Marriage gave a man access to a woman's body, whether she wanted it or not. And yet, some men didn't press that right. Some asked, waited, listened. You wonder about them, the quiet husbands, the patient ones, the ones who reached for their wives not with hunger, but with tenderness, who asked, "Is this all right?" with their hands instead of words, who knew when to pull close and when to give space. They existed. History doesn't write poems about them, but they were there. They were the men who watched their wives wince after childbirth and didn't touch them for months, not because they didn't want to, but because they understood. They were the ones who plucked lice from their lover's hair without complaint, who rubbed balm onto cracked heels, who whispered, "Sleep now. I'll take the early shift with the baby." And that was love too. Not loud, not lyrical, just present. You lie still remembering how many acts of medieval love happened without fanfare, without candles or music or the perfect moment. They happened between chores, between tragedies, between church bells. Maybe your lover pressed a kiss to your shoulder while you were still half asleep. Maybe you touched their cheek as you passed each other in the field. Maybe your fingers brushed as you reached for the same hunk of bread, and the contact made your heart stutter. Love lived in the smallness, and sometimes it lived in the aftermath, because the morning after mattered. There was no casual nudity, no stumbling into the kitchen in a sheet, no coffee and jokes. There was dressing quickly, avoiding eye contact with the in-laws, pulling straw from your hair, and pretending nothing had happened, even if it had meant everything. You had chores to do, bread to bake, a cow to chase. You didn't lounge around together. You didn't debrief. But sometimes you smiled. A brief thing, shared, unspoken. Maybe you touched hands again before heading out the door. Maybe that touch carried all the things you couldn't say in public. "I liked last night. I like you. I hope we can find time again." And sometimes you didn't get to say anything at all, because the medieval world didn't guarantee you a future, or even another night. You loved in real time, urgently, gratefully. And when you slept curled around each other like the world might end before morning, because it might. So you tighten your grip now, pull them closer. You feel the curve of their spine against your chest, the brush of their hair against your face, and you think, if this is the only soft thing I ever get, let it be enough. Let this be the memory I carry when winter comes, when roads grow dangerous, when distance stretches between us again. Let this bed, scratchy, crowded, imperfect, be the place where I loved you well. You don't know how long you've been lying there half awake. The fire's gone out completely now, leaving only the scent of old ash and faint smoke. The air is cold against your face, but warm beneath the covers where your bodies are tucked close, knees to backs, hands tucked into elbows. This is the quiet middle of the night, the medieval watch when dreams tangle with memory and everything feels half real. You run your fingers slowly along the edge of the blanket and think of the beds you've seen in your life. Some made of rope and wood sagging in the middle, others of stone with furs piled high, some with straw stuffed into ticking sacks so loud that every movement crackled like dry leaves, and some that weren't beds at all, just corners of barns or patches of earth under trees, or the hayloft with beams so low you had to duck to lie down. Because for many lovers in the Middle Ages, a bed was a luxury, privacy even rarer. You might find yourself pressed together behind a stable door, or in the shadow of the parish wall, or curled in a cloak in the back of a wagon. Anywhere that gave you 5 minutes of silence, warmth, and space to kiss someone like you meant it. But even when you had a bed, it wasn't always yours. In many homes, beds were shared across generations. Grandparents, toddlers, guests. You didn't always get to sleep beside the one you loved. And even when you did, you weren't always alone. Sometimes there was a child between you. sometimes a servant at your feet, sometimes a dog curled between your legs, twitching in its dreams. And that meant intimacy had to be quiet, strategic, half-lit, half-breathed. There were rules you invented without saying them. A squeeze of the wrist meant wait. A shift of the hips meant now. A pressed toe against a calf meant not here. This was a choreography of glances and gestures. You moved like dancers, like thieves. And it was in that tension, in that restraint, that desire bloomed. Because nothing makes the heart pound like almost. Almost touching. Almost found. Almost undone. And in that ache of almostness, you discovered how creative love could be. You whispered poems even if you barely knew how to read. You pressed wildflowers into each other's pockets. You stole small things, a button, a ribbon, a lock of hair, and hid them in your boot or your bodice as if they were treasures. They were treasures because you didn't have selfies, or love songs, or video calls. You had tokens, little physical echoes of affection. Things you could touch when you were apart. Things you could sleep beside when the real body wasn't there. Imagine that now, reaching into your pouch and pulling out the small wooden bead he carved for you, or the piece of lace she tore from her sleeve. Holding it tight in your palm while you sleep on a cold floor, the smell of manure drifting in from the barn, and feeling comforted. Because love in your world was so easily lost. To war, to plague, to childbirth, to famine. You didn't expect forever. You expected now. So you loved like it mattered. You kissed like it might be the last time. Because it might be. That was the strange beauty of medieval love. It held grief inside it from the beginning. You could love someone with your whole heart and still know the ground might take them tomorrow. And still, you chose to love them anyway. Which meant that every shared bed, every touch, every whispered word in the dark was an act of defiance. You loved despite the risk, despite the mud on the floor and the blood on your hands and the fear in your chest. You chose to reach out in the dark. You think about those moments, those breathless, blinking minutes right before sleep, when a lover's hand slips into yours under the blanket. No words, just warmth. You think about how many people across centuries have done the same thing. Not in castles, but in huts. Not in velvet beds, but on piles of straw. You think about how love doesn't need poetry or music or perfection. It just needs presence. And sometimes it needs laughter. Because despite everything, the rules, the risks, the rot people still found time to laugh in bed. They laughed when the bed creaked too loudly, when the dog jumped up uninvited, when someone got a cramp mid-embrace, when the candle blew out too soon and everything tumbled into darkness and elbows. There's joy in that chaos. There's something deeply tender about making love in a world that does everything it can to keep you apart. You curl in closer now. Your lover makes a soft sound, a sigh, or maybe just the shift of breath in sleep. You listen to it like a lullaby. You reach out and touch the edge of their hand. Fingertips to fingertips. That's all. And it's enough. Because in this moment, in this bed, in this narrow sliver of silence between the flicker of history and the breath of morning, you are warm. You are not alone. You are loved. Your fingers linger against theirs, the skin dry, warm, slightly rough from work. Hands that knead bread, lift buckets, mend seams. Not delicate, but capable. Hands that when they touch you, feel like home. You don't open your eyes. You just breathe. Because right now in this bed, nothing matters more than staying still, staying close, and pretending for just a little longer that the world outside doesn't exist. You know what's waiting. The ache of work. The scratch of wool. The cold wash basin. The shouted orders. The endless rhythm of hunger effort, silence, and prayer. But this moment is yours. And it's in this stillness, wrapped in threadbare blankets and soft breath, that your mind drifts to the things lovers dared not say aloud. Because the Middle Ages weren't kind to those who loved differently. There were people, so many people, who didn't fit the mold, who loved outside the lines drawn by church and crown, who whispered their longing in languages that didn't yet have names for them. Two women sitting too close at the weaving table. Two boys who lingered in the orchard long after everyone else went in. A widow who never remarried, but who always shared her bed with her companion. A knight who avoided the eyes of every noblewoman, but carried a painting of his squire pressed close to his chest during battle. They existed, they loved, and they feared. Because while same-sex affection wasn't always persecuted in every village, in every time it was rarely safe, the church's laws were loud even when the people's hearts were quiet. Sodomy was a sin, deviance a crime, and love, real aching love between two people of the same gender, was dangerous. But it happened. It bloomed anyway. In letters that never reached their destination, in glances across the candle-lit refectory, in hands that lingered too long during prayer. Some found ways to be together quietly. Others lived lives of double silence, never confessing, never risking holding that secret like a warm coal in the center of their chest. And even in straight marriages, there were unspoken truths. Desire didn't always match expectation. Some people felt too much. Some felt nothing at all. There were women who loved their husbands deeply, but flinched when touched. There were men who loved their wives like sisters, not lovers. There were couples who stayed together out of habit, and others who never touched again after the first child. And yet, they shared a bed. Because that was the way. Beds weren't just romantic spaces. They were practical ones, obligatory ones, and sometimes heartbreaking ones. You think of the woman who lies next to a man she doesn't love because her dowry said she must. You think of the man who turns his face away in the dark because he longs for someone else. You think of all the people who wept into their pillows quietly while their partners slept. But you also think of those who found joy anyway, who found ways to comfort each other, who grew to care even if the passion faded. Because love in the medieval sense wasn't always about fire and thunder. It was about staying, returning, sharing bread, pulling lice from each other's hair, singing softly while the other one fell asleep. It was love shaped by time, not lightning. You roll slightly, listening to the creak of the frame. Someone else in the house stirs. Maybe a child. Maybe a servant. You don't know, but your body tenses just slightly, because privacy is never guaranteed. Not even now. And this moment, this hush, this warmth might be interrupted at any second. So you press closer. You press your face into the curve of their neck where it smells like ash and wool and them. You memorize that scent, that warmth. You press your knees into the backs of their knees and think, please, just a little longer. That's what medieval lovers prayed for, not eternity, not passion, not poetry. Just a little longer. One more night without war. One more night without plague. One more night where the children sleep soundly, and the fire doesn't go out, and the baby doesn't cry, and no one calls your name before dawn. Just one more night of quiet. And even when the quiet broke, even when the sun rose and the rooster screamed and your body groaned into the ache of morning, you remembered that one moment. The warmth of someone's palm against yours. The echo of their breath in your ear. The way they said your name soft and simple like it mattered. Because in a world that didn't promise you much, not peace, not health, not even tomorrow, those tiny gifts were everything. You breathe in now, slow and deep. The scent of old wood, burned tallow, sweat, and something softer underneath it all, faint but real. Love. Not in the way you might define it now, but love nonetheless. Because even here in the dark, beneath scratchy sheets and the weight of the past, it's clear. People didn't love less back then. They just had fewer words for it, fewer chances, fewer tomorrows. But they made do. They reached out. They held on. They whispered into the dark, You're the softest thing I know. You're still lying there. Time has stretched into something loose, something strange. You've lost track of how long you've been awake. But you don't want to move. Because if you do, the spell might break. The warmth might spill out. The breath against your back might turn cold. So you stay. Still. Quiet. Listening to the soft creaks of the rafters and the faint shuffle of someone else's dreaming limbs. And as you lie there, you think about all the ways the medieval bed was more than a bed. It was a witness to births, deaths, secrets. It was where people came into the world and where they left it. It was where inheritance was decided, where confessions were made. It was the place where people whispered their final thoughts into someone else's chest and hoped to be remembered. Beds weren't just furniture. They were legacy. In wealthier homes, a bed could be passed down through generations. Carved oak, heavy curtains, linen sheets embroidered with initials. A symbol of status, but also of intimacy. Because no matter how ornate the bed frame, what happened within its bounds was deeply human. It was messy. It was honest. It was sometimes boring. And it wasn't always romantic. Sometimes the bed was the site of obligation, of duty, of transactions cloaked in the language of love. A woman would lie back, eyes closed, hands folded over her chest, as her husband did what was expected. Not cruelly, just routinely. Because not all marriages were partnerships. Many were arrangements. She brought land. He brought protection. She bore children. He provided livestock. It worked. Until it didn't. And sometimes those quiet nights of routine turned into silent mornings of resentment. But other times, something unexpected happened. Affection. Two people who had never chosen each other began to soften. He brought her a sprig of lavender once without saying why. She laughed at one of his jokes and touched his arm in that easy way that made his heart jump. They started sharing bread, then secrets, then warmth. It wasn't fireworks. It was a slow burn, a glow. And when they lay together at night, it was with something like tenderness. Not passion, not even love maybe, but care. And care was rare. especially when the world outside was so cruel. Because in the Middle Ages, your body wasn't safe, not just from violence or disease, but from judgment. You were told what to feel, what not to feel, what parts of yourself to ignore. Pleasure was suspect, female pleasure especially. There were entire theological debates over whether women were even supposed to feel desire, whether it was necessary for conception, whether it was dangerous for the soul. Some men believed it was their duty to keep women modest, quiet, obedient. But others quietly, carefully learned how to listen. They paid attention to what made her laugh, to the way her breath caught when touched just right, to the way she softened when spoken to gently. And some women, more than history ever gave credit for, began to ask for what they wanted. Not loudly, not boldly, but in the privacy of a shared bed with the candles blown out and the blankets pulled tight, they reached for what felt good. They guided hands. They shifted hips. They whispered there, like that. Not always. Not often. But enough. Enough that pleasure, even in its most fleeting form, became part of the story. Not every night, of course. Some nights were cold, awkward, silent. But some nights, some rare golden nights, were filled with soft giggles and warm hands, and the kind of intimacy that made everything else disappear. You feel it now just thinking about it. The way someone touches your face in the dark, not to arouse but to reassure. The way a body presses closer, not from lust, but from comfort. The way two people wrapped in the same blanket and the same long, hard life somehow managed to find a little joy together. And joy was revolutionary, because joy didn't serve the church. It didn't feed the Lord's table. It didn't till the field. But it fed the soul. It was the hidden feast to the secret song, the stolen apple. Joy was dangerous and precious, and it often started in bed, with a look, a laugh, a shared piece of cheese under the covers, a whispered story, a playful tug at a nightshirt. You think now of all the moments lost to history, not the wars, not the kings, not the executions, but the private ones. The wife who scratched her husband's back until he fell asleep. The servant who stayed up an extra hour just to tuck a blanket around her friend's feet. The two young lovers who dared to sleep facing each other, noses almost touching, knowing they'd be scolded if caught. That's the real history. Not the battles, not the politics. The softness, the choice to love even when everything around you said not to bother. So you reach again without thinking and find their hand in the dark. And they squeeze just once, like always. And for a moment, that squeeze is all you need to believe that the world is not as cruel as it pretends to be. That here in the hush between midnight and morning, you are safe. You are seen. You are held. The squeeze of their hand still lingers in your palm. You don't need light to see them. You know every angle by now, the bend of the elbow, the dip of the collarbone, the way the spine curves when they sleep on their side. You could draw them in your mind with your eyes closed, and maybe that's what love really is in this world, memorizing someone's outline in the dark. Because here, love isn't dramatic. It isn't candlelit poetry or grand declarations across rose gardens. It's quieter than that. It's something that gets folded into the routine of survival. It's how they reach across your body for the blanket without waking you. How they pass you the heel of the bread without asking if you want it. How they share the last of the dried pears and say it's because they're not hungry when you both know they are. That's what makes the bed sacred. Not just what happens between the sheets, but everything that happens before and after. The way you come to it sore and wind-chapped after a day in the fields. The way you leave it in the morning, hands stiff, eyes blurry, but hearts slightly steadier. You remember one winter, maybe 2 years ago, though. Time has no sharp edges anymore, when the wind howled through the walls and the roof dripped something cold into the center of the room. And you both lay curled so tightly together that it was impossible to tell whose leg was whose. And that night, your bodies made a kind of promise to each other, even if your mouths didn't. Stay warm, stay close, don't go. Because even if the world didn't give you much, no titles, no fortune, no soft linen, you had this. This shared heat, this shared hush, this one square of safety in a brutal world. You imagine all the couples through history who made that same promise in different ways. A woman cradling her husband's frost-bitten fingers under the blankets, whispering prayers to Saint Nicholas. A man rubbing his wife's back as she trembled with fever, tucking extra furs around her feet. Two lovers, not supposed to be lovers, sharing a mattress in a shepherd's hut, kissing in the silent language of those who don't know when or if they'll ever be alone again. Because if you think the Middle Ages were a time of simplicity, of traditional values, of straightforward rules, you're wrong. The lines between love and arrangement, between duty and desire, were always blurry. Even the church knew it. That's why there were so many rules, so many warnings, so many rituals to remind you where not to place your hands, where not to let your eyes wander. Because people did wander. They broke rules. They made love in forests, behind altars, in the beds of people they weren't married to, and sometimes in beds they didn't even own. And while the priests thundered from the pulpit, while the law scribes wrote down punishments, people continued to slip into one another's arms and whisper things they knew they shouldn't say. Desire doesn't care about law, and love, real aching love, has never waited for permission. You roll onto your back and stare at the ceiling again, though you can't see it in the dark. Your thoughts drift to the stories you've heard. The woman who dressed as a boy to follow her sweetheart to war. The monk who fell in love with a baker's daughter and left the cloister in the middle of the night, barefoot, just to sleep beside her one more time. The noblewoman who married an old man for land, but gave her heart to the kitchen maid who braided her hair each morning. These stories don't show up in the chronicles. No ink was spared on them in the dusty books of kings and battles. But they are real as yours. And when you touch the edge of your lover's shoulder now, and they murmur something sleepy and half-said, you know you're part of that same unwritten history. A story told in sheets, not scrolls. And sheets back then weren't always clean, or even dry. Washing was rare. Laundry was work. Beds smelled like skin and breath, and sometimes like sickness. But they also smelled like life. Like herbs tucked under the mattress to ward off illness. Like beeswax from a candle stub still flickering in the corner. Like sweat and soil and breadcrumbs crushed between two sleeping bodies. It wasn't perfect, but it was human. And human was enough. You smile a little now thinking about how love really looked back then. It looked like someone keeping your side of the bed warm when you came back late. It looked like fingers tracing invisible shapes on your back to help you fall asleep. It looked like someone whispering, "We'll figure it out tomorrow," even when they had no idea how. And sometimes, it looked like the opposite. like sleeping with your backs turned, like silence stretched too thin, like tension that never broke. Because not every bed was kind. There were nights when you lay there, fists clenched, staring at the wall, feeling the heat of someone beside you, but not daring to speak. There were marriages that held no love, arrangements that held no trust, beds that became battlegrounds not for desire but for dominance. Those stories matter too, because they remind you of what was at stake when love did happen, when it bloomed unexpectedly, when it reached across all that silence and shame and fear and said, "Still I want you. Still I'll lie beside you. Still I'll share this small world we've made together, inside the walls, inside the night, inside the blankets. Still I'll reach for your hand in the dark." And for a moment, just a moment, it feels like nothing's changed at all. The fire is long gone now. The coals are cold. The room has fallen into the kind of silence that feels thick like wool. Only the faintest of noises remain, a low sigh from someone across the room, the scratch of something in the walls, the wind dragging its fingers along the outside shutters. But inside the bed there is warmth, faint, flickering alive. Your fingers are still intertwined. Their chest rises and falls slow and even pressed against your back. You don't speak. There's no need. Because even without words, the body remembers. And tonight, you remember something else too, how little control you had over your own bed. Because in medieval Europe, your bed was never just yours. If you were wealthy, your bed was a symbol, a performance space, a wooden stage for your family's power. It was where heirs were conceived. Treaties were sealed with marriage, and public viewings of consummation sometimes took place to satisfy both parties that the contract was complete. Royal beds were massive, towering, draped in velvet or brocade. But don't mistake grandeur for privacy. A queen's bed might host not just her husband, but a cluster of attendants, handmaidens, even courtiers loitering in the background while she tried to sleep. In fact, privacy was so rare that some queens invented illnesses just to retreat into solitude. And in less noble homes, the lack of privacy was not symbolic, it was structural. Families shared beds. Children curled up between parents. Aunts slept beside nephews. Grandmothers beside infants. You might share a mattress with 3 generations. You might roll over in the night and be met with a snore, a sneeze, or a foot in your stomach. Love had to exist around it, or in spite of it. That's why so many medieval lovers became artists of timing. They watched for harvest feasts and holy days, for nights when others stumbled home drunk and slept deeply. They listened for silence. They moved carefully under blankets, slow, subtle, barely more than a shift in breath. And sometimes they didn't even try to hide. Because the truth is, not every society was the same. In some rural communities, premarital co-sleeping was quietly accepted as long as it pointed toward eventual marriage. Bundling, they called it in some places. 2 young people lying in bed together with a bundling board between them. A thick plank of wood, or sometimes a sewn sack around the girl's legs to prevent intimacy. Parents approved. It was a way to encourage emotional closeness before formal commitment. Of course, the boards were not foolproof. They were removed, climbed over, ignored entirely. Because curiosity, attraction, affection, they're not bound by wood or wool or warning. And the truth is, many medieval couples found their way to love through practice, not ceremony. Marriage often came after the bed. There were contracts signed between families when a child was still in the cradle. But there were also unions formed through nothing more than shared labor, shared meals, shared nights. A man and woman who lived together, slept together, and were accepted by their village as husband and wife. These couples were often treated as married in all but name. No priest, no witness. Just shared breath and a life built slowly in the shadows of the everyday. And those lives, those homes, they were full of quiet gestures. A woman patching the same pair of stockings for the 4th time. A man walking an extra mile to trade for sweet apples because she loved them. A couple taking turns holding a crying baby through a sleepless winter. No grand romance, but steady love. You shift a little now, thinking about how many generations before you laid in this exact same stillness, in this exact same hope that their partner would stay warm through the night. Maybe your own parents. Maybe the lovers whose names you never knew, but whose fingerprints still live in the fibers of this blanket. The bed holds memories long after bodies have gone. That's why it was one of the most valuable items in a medieval household. Beds were named in wills passed on through dowries, protected in legal disputes. Because a bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a record of a life, where love was made, where children were born, where someone said goodbye for the last time, and where the survivor stayed, staring at the empty half of the mattress, listening to silence that no longer comforted. You breathe in. The air is cooler now. Your partner shifts behind you, half awake maybe, or simply adjusting. You stay still, letting them settle. Because the older you get, the more you realize how rare stillness like this is. How precious. Even now you can hear the faint clatter of the world outside. The debts, the obligations, the whisper of frost creeping across the thatch. But in here, in the hush of your shared bed, you are safe. You think about all the medieval lovers who never had this, who never had peace, who only ever touched in panic, in secrecy, in desperation. And you ache for them. You ache for the girl married off at 14, who learned what her husband looked like on their wedding night and never again wanted to see his face. You ache for the boy who spent his life pretending he didn't flinch when the village girls smiled at him. You ache for the widow who lay on her back for the 4th time in her life with a new man, a new contract, and the same old numbness. But most of all, you ache for those who never got to be held like this, gently, without agenda, without expectation, just held. You wrap your arm around the body next to you now and pull them just a little closer, not to start anything, not to say anything, just to be near. Because here in the dark, in the forgotten folds of time, love, real love, was always softest when it asked for nothing but to stay. You don't know when you fell asleep, maybe just a minute ago, maybe an hour. But when your eyes blink open again, it's still dark, still quiet. The world hasn't begun yet. And the body beside you, still warm, still steady, is breathing in rhythm with yours. That's the thing you notice most. Not the straw poking through the mattress or the ache in your shoulder. It's the rhythm, shared, anchoring. You think for a moment of what it means to trust someone enough to sleep beside them. To close your eyes. To let your guard down. In a time when strangers could become thieves, and thieves could become ghosts, choosing to rest with someone really rest was one of the deepest forms of faith. You didn't need to say, "I love you." You just needed to lie still and stay. And for many lovers, that was the most they could offer. Because the truth is, medieval love was often quiet, not by choice, but by necessity. There were mouths to feed, wool to card, bread to knead, war to survive, plague to outrun. You didn't spend hours talking about your feelings. You spent them keeping the hearth warm and the baby from coughing herself awake. Love was folded into the seams of work. The man who repaired the cartwheel without being asked. The woman who kept a slice of apple aside knowing he liked it best. The young girl who washed the blood from her lover's tunic after he came back from a street brawl. There were no love languages. There were survival languages. And yet somehow love still bloomed. It bloomed in late-night touches, in mumbled apologies after arguments, in the way people learned to reach for each other even when their hands were cracked and tired. You think now of the nights when you shared this bed, but not your words. When something had been said during the day, something too sharp, too careless, and you both went to sleep facing opposite walls. Those nights happened in the Middle Ages, too. Two people lying inches apart, feeling like miles. But then maybe sometime before dawn, one turned over, reached out, let their fingertips rest lightly on a wrist, not grabbing, just asking. And the other answered, with a shift, a sigh, an almost imperceptible press of knuckles against fabric. Because in a world where life could turn in a single hour, from feast to famine, from celebration to burial, holding a grudge too long was a luxury few could afford. Forgiveness, like everything else, was practical. You needed each other to draw water, to harvest grain, to survive the winter. But beyond that, you wanted each other. That was the miracle. Not just the duty, but the desire. Desire to lie close. Desire to be known. Desire to stay. And yes, that desire sometimes returned to the body. There were nights even after years together when hands wandered, when breath caught, when laughter bloomed like spring in the dark, when bodies remembered the joy of it, not for children, not for legacy, but just for pleasure. And pleasure, though rarely spoken of, was never completely forgotten. You imagine her now, your partner, your companion, she's still closed, a faint curve of a smile on her lips, even in sleep. And you think about how many women found ways to carve out pleasure in a world that denied them so much. They learned which herbs to use to ease pain, which foods stirred warmth, which times of the month brought more comfort than risk. They talked to each other over spinning wheels in gardens behind closed shutters. They passed down quiet wisdom, and the men who listened. They learned too, not from books, from each other, from experience, from attention. Because in a world where no one handed you a manual on how to love someone, you had to write it yourself night by night, in the folds of a shared blanket and the hush of second sleep. That's what you've done. Maybe imperfectly, but honestly. And it shows in how they stir now, reaching back toward you in their sleep, finding your arm and resting their hand on top of it. Not gripping, just grounding. The kind of touch that says you're real. I'm here. Keep breathing. You close your eyes again. You remember the first night you ever shared this bed. The nervous laughter, the false starts, the sudden panic about your breath or your knees, or whether they would change their mind. And now it's just this. Simple. Soft. Not new, but known, and you realize that's the goal. Not butterflies, not drama. Just a place to lie down and not be afraid. a place to return to again and again through cold nights, through long seasons, through the weary turning of time. You let yourself drift, knowing morning will come, eventually. But for now, the room is still. The bed holds your weight. The warmth holds your hope. And your body, no longer guarded, no longer aching, is held. There's a shift in the air now. The kind of shift that doesn't come with a sound, but a feeling. A lightness near the window. A softening of the dark. Morning hasn't arrived, but it's on its way. The night is letting go. You can feel it before you see it. And still you don't move. Not yet. Because this in-between hour is the most sacred of all. The final moments when the world still belongs to you and your lover and no one else. Before the boots stomp across floorboards. Before the baby wails. Before someone calls your name to come stoke the hearth. For now it's just breath and body and the heaviness of blankets pulled up to the chin. And you think maybe that's why medieval lovers clung so tightly to each other during the night, because they knew what morning would take from them. The Middle Ages didn't wait. It didn't care that you were still tired, that your dreams hadn't finished, that your arms weren't ready to let go yet. When the cock crowed, you rose, you dressed, you prayed, you started again. And so the nights mattered more. Nights were the only hours that belonged to you. To your aching muscles, your curious fingers, your whispered nonsense. And sometimes, to your grief. You think now of all the beds that held not love but sorrow. The empty half where someone used to lie. The damp pillow that stayed damp even weeks later. The child who didn't make it through the winter. The partner who left and never came back. The bed became a mirror, a reminder, a wound that never healed properly. But still people lay in them. Still they slept. Still they reached out for warmth wherever they could find it. Because survival wasn't just about bread and fire and boots with soles. It was about touch, about softness, about having someone to lie beside even if your world was falling apart, especially then. You think about the women who nursed their husbands through fevers, wiping their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar and rose water. The men who wrapped blankets around their wives and sang lullabies with cracked voices and no tune at all. The lovers who couldn't save each other, but who stayed anyway, holding hands until the very end, and then holding the empty space after. The bed became a chapel, a shrine, not to sex, not even to love, but to presence, to the act of staying. You shift slightly now, your joints stiff, your breath slow. Your partner makes a small sound, half sigh, half murmur, and you settle again, letting the hush wrap around you like another blanket. You wonder what people in the future will think about you, about this life, about this bed. Will they imagine silk sheets and candles and long poetic nights? Or will they understand the truth that most nights were nothing more than two tired people lying still in the dark, trying to keep each other warm, trying to make it to morning, and sometimes failing, but sometimes not. Sometimes love survived the coughing and the arguments and the mud and the hunger. Sometimes it crawled under the covers with you and stayed there through every season. And when it did, it didn't need much. Just a soft word now and then, a palm pressed to the small of a back, a murmur into the pillow that said, "I'm still here." Because in a world where people disappeared constantly into war, into plague, into fields and marriages, and death, being here was everything. Being alive beside someone else was everything. You blink slowly now, and the faintest trace of gray is showing around the shutter slats. You know what comes next. The fire will need tending. Your clothes will be stiff with cold. The house will stir floor by floor as the quiet dies. But you have one more breath here. One more pause. You curl a little closer and listen to the chest beside you rise, fall, rise again. And you think about the lovers who came before you. Thousands of them. All lying like this. All holding on to this same kind of silence. This same hope. This same brief miracle. A night not interrupted. A body not taken. A love not forgotten. And it makes you want to stay just a little longer. Maybe only one more minute. But long enough to remember how this feels. How it always felt. Even back then, even now. There it is, the rooster far off but unmistakable, a sound that breaks the spell. You exhale slowly, fingers tightening for just a second around the hand that never let go. Your eyes are still closed, but you know the world is waking. The air smells different, more movement, more weight. You listen. A floorboard creaks in the next room. A bucket clangs, cold water being carried in. The breath beside you deepens, almost like they're willing themselves to sleep through the noise, clinging to the last thread of rest. You do the same, because you both know this is the final minute. Soon you'll separate. Sit up. Dress without speaking much. One boot at a time. The silence of lovers replaced by the silence of labor. But for now, you're still in the bed, still wrapped in night, still in the time when love feels stronger than duty. You wonder again how many people in the centuries before you lay exactly like this. Not noble, not poetic. Just human. Two people. One bed. One more morning together. You roll slightly and rest your head in the crook of their shoulder. It smells like wool and sleep and something so familiar it aches. You let your eyes close again. Not to dream, but to remember. This is what love looked like. Not just what happened in the dark, under blankets, behind closed doors, but what happened after. When you stayed, when you didn't pull away, when you didn't rush to speak or move or let the world back in. You just stayed, still, breathing, listening. Remembering that in the long, harsh centuries of mud and fire and silence, this here now, this was the softest thing history ever held. And now, you've made it through the long night. You can let go of the candlelight flickering against cold stone walls. Let go of the scratch of straw beneath your back, the breath of a lover sleeping beside you, the hush of a world that never promised gentleness, but gave it quietly when no one was looking. There's no need to carry it all with you. You can leave the sounds behind, the rustling shift of wool, the groan of wood, the distant stir of the early morning bell tower. It's all fading now. You're safe. The night has done its work. You've wandered through centuries without lifting a foot, listened to the silence of hundreds of sleepers before you. You've felt their warmth, their ache, their closeness, their hope. And now all you have to do is rest. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands unclench. There's no more reaching tonight. No more trying. You've arrived. And as your thoughts quiet down to a whisper, and your breath grows slower and heavier, you realize you were never alone in the dark. Someone somewhere was always lying beside someone else, whispering, "Stay a little longer," just like you are now. So let yourself sleep. Let history fade into dreams. Let the bed hold your weight. Let the past wrap around you like a worn blanket passed down through time. You're safe. You're still. You're home.